I'm just going to record it in the cloud. Okay, that's great. Thank you for joining in. And we're going to be looking at, furthering our discussion on, the learning outcome 4, which is for the first unit, in which we've been covering the understanding of principles and practices of internal quality assurance. So we've come to learning outcome 4 today, wherein the main aspect of this learning outcome is to understand. Again, it's a theoretical one because it says understand. So here we are looking at understanding the legal and practice requirements for working as an IQA. Now, very briefly, just to mention a couple of things. For example, when we look at getting into the role of the IQA, what could be the practical and legal requirements from our perspective to get into this particular role? So when we look at the practical requirements could be that you are experienced, you are essentially having some sort of academic qualification or prior experience to be able to work as an internal quality assurer, and the training that you've received or the academic training that you have done over the years equips you with the toolkit which allows you to function as an effective person doing the internal verification of records or assessments, essentially here in an educational setup. Now, although when we look at this as a requirement, there could be no formal requirements as well, because there are people who have had a number of years of experience and they've gained qualifications or gained experience rather than qualifications in, kind of getting used to the process of how they would perform internal verification. But generally speaking, when we look at academic benchmarks, there are a set of minimum requirements which people need to have to be able to work as an IQA. Now, most of the bits that you need to look at from practical point of view tend to be academic qualification, experience, and the ability to have worked as an assessor for a certain period of your time before you start getting into the processes of or the process of managing the IQA as a function within an educational setup. Some of the main requirements tend to be that you understand who are learners, you understand and are able to differentiate who are the assessors. You're able to monitor and provide feedback to both assessors and learners, and this feedback over a point of time can be monitored to see if there are improvements being made, and you are also having the ability to standardize the process of assessments across various assessors. So that would be, say, the practical requirements. Now, when we look at legal requirements and legal requirements of being an IQA, what you're essentially looking at is that in various setups or in, say, for example, various educational institutions, there could be some sort of minimum, I would say, requirements they've put forward for the purposes of somebody who can work as an IQA. And these legal requirements tend to be, regulation related. And regulation related would mean that you are having an academic qualification, you have had this qualification which is fit for purpose, and you understand that you have a CPD or career professional development plan which has allowed you to step into that particular role. So if I look at sports management, for example, and I want to do IQA for sports management, I might not have the relevant, practical experience. I might have a academic qualification, but one of the legal requirements of working as an IQA within sports management, when you work, say, for example, as a IQA for gym instructors and things like that, you would need to have the practical experience to understand how in a particular setup the assessments can be performed, or how the assessors would do the assessments in that particular setup. And in such cases, you would need to have legal requirements. You will have to meet those legal requirements to be able to work as a quality assurer in that field. Similarly, when you look at healthcare, similarly, when you look at specialist areas or disciplines like law, I might say that I'm an IQA, but are you having the CPD to be able to work within that sector? And that, although you have the academic qualification and you have experience of working as an IQA, but legal requirements might mean that you need to understand some of the legal requirements from a point of view of regulation, to be able to work effectively within that role, and that could be put forward as what is called regulatory requirements or legal requirements. So in terms of understanding these requirements for IQA, one such simple example that I would give you is anybody who's in that particular role of IQA, legal requirement would be that you are over the age of 18, or you're over the age of, obviously 18 means that you've just got into the role, but having over the age of 18, but having about 5 to 7 years of experience, and you must be a qualified assessor, and your experience and qualifications in terms of CPD should be up to date when you're working as an IQA. So those could be termed as what are called, legal requirements or regulatory requirements. This is what we are expected to study in this learning outcome, because the main bits that we have to look at now after understanding, going through learning outcome one, which is understand the principles and the basic theoretical frameworks of what is involved in the IQA process, then looking at how you look at maintaining the quality of the IQA process in the institution, and then look at how do you improve the process of quality assurance within the organization. Here we are looking at legal and regulatory requirements which are required for you to practice as an IQA within the higher education, or say, for example, a particular setup. And there are 4 assessment criteria we are looking at covering. So one is understanding what are the legal issues, policies, and procedures that you need to be aware of. The second one would be to understand the role of technology and how it can help us in, obviously automating, making the process of internal quality assurance or verification simpler, more effective, and more productive, so that it's able to pick out areas which are gap areas, is able to pick out areas where an improvement needs to be made. It is able to pick out when you do these meetings, which are standardization meetings, you're able to, then pick out areas which are requiring further attention or further development. The third part would be to look at the reflective practice. That means, obviously, in teaching and education, most qualifications at some stage have an element of reflective practice. So what we want to be able to look at is, essentially discuss what would be the reflective practice applicable in the case of, IQA. So when we do talk about reflective practice, we can look at the Klopp's learning cycle, or the Gibbs, the Gibbs learning cycle, and also we can look at, the framework, which is the 6-step framework, primarily, which is utilized to do reflection on how you're doing within a particular field. So we can look at 2 of these theoretical frameworks and then look at how it informs you to further develop yourself in this discipline. And the last assessment criteria talks about, how do you look at maintaining equality and diversity when you look at doing the IQA process. So you might be working in diverse environment, you might be working with different cultures, you might be working with different IQAs, you might be having different, let's say, centers or locations in which you are requiring to do an IQA. Your organization might have different branches or campuses or centers wherein you would require to work with different people, and how do you ensure that you are looking at meeting that requirement of equality and diversity as far as carrying out the process of IQA is concerned. So these are the 4 assessment criteria that we are looking at discussing in detail today with regards to learning outcome 4, which is the last learning outcome. So let's look at going over to some presentation slides which I've got. And these slides essentially, would go into details of what we are looking at discussing today. So fair bit of indicative content, which is given in the, learning outcome 4. So we look at some legal and practice requirements. We will look at, obviously, the application of reflective practice. We look at some good practices which can be utilized. And, you can bring some of those practices in within, the processes of IQA when you are actually looking at working in this role and using those best practices. How do you look at ensuring that equality and diversity is maintained as far as, the process that you carry out, which is assessments, and the evaluation of assessments that you carry out is done in a fair and consistent manner. Now, with terms of key terminology, I've got 2 questions which I want to go through. And these 2 questions are in terms of, they could come to your mind when you look at, going through the learning outcome, which says, understand the legal and practice requirements for internal quality assurance of assessment. So what are these two, key parts of the learning outcome? So what are the legal issues, policies and procedures relevant to the IQA process? Any thoughts on that? Any, ideas? What could be the legal issues, policies, procedures that you have to adhere to as as an internal quality assurer? So in some cases, when you think of policies, go into the keywords like legal issues, look at policies, look at procedures. So when you look at into policies, things like there are basic policies when you look at when a center approval happens for a delivery of a qualification, they look at certain policies and procedures which are in place or at least present in the center. Now, these tend to be related to things like health and safety, data protection. It tends to be policies like malpractice. It tends to be policies like teaching and learning strategy. It could have policies which are related to internal verification. So what is the internal verification policy that you're going to follow? What is the assessment policy that you're going to follow? What is the malpractice policy, and how is it defining the requirements of the awarding organization? You would also look at things like confidentiality in terms of assessments. They're not to be discussed outside the say, for example, relevant learner, or if there is a feedback which has been given to the assessor, then in such cases, if there is a dialogue happening between the IQA and the assessor, then that needs to remain confidential. Data protection could be one such policy that you look at. And legal and regulatory issues would be that you have a firm understanding of, I would say, requirements of the IQA process. So, for example, in such cases, tends to be that if I'm looking at IQAing for level 6 and 7, I need to have a master's level qualification to be able to IQA that work, or basically verify that work. If I'm looking at doing a qualification verification for level 4 and 5, I need to have at least a bachelor's degree, and that could be a legal requirement, so that you are, in terms of carrying out that process, one, you have the authority, second, you have the experience, third, you're meeting the minimum criteria which is set as legal requirements to work within that particular role. So some of these things that you can think of would follow, and would answer that question, that what are the legal issues or policies which are relevant to the IQA process. Now, the second question which comes to our mind is, which is related to the one of the assessment criteria and the learning outcome is that how can technology contribute to IQA process? Now, most of this, as we understand, when we look at the process of internal verification, most of it tends to be, paper driven. In some cases now, electronically done on documents, but essentially still is paper driven. So what could be the role of technology in the IQA process? In terms of, why is it that we feel that technology needs to now be included in our discussions when we look at the whole process of internal quality assurance? Any thoughts or any ideas on that?
I think technology might help in creating some kind of a repository of, whatever has pertaining to that particular learner, whatever we are uh, collecting the information from that person, it can act as a repository.
So one part could be, which you rightly said, is data management, or some, say, for example, management of data, which could be done, and that would be something that you could look at as a process or as a contribution which technology makes. Now, there are lots of other things that we fall back on when we look at the final checking of, assessment. For example, you've got a couple of assignments which have come up, or a couple of observations which have come up, for the process of internal verification. Now, what you do at some stage is, in order to see the full, let's say picture or fuller picture, you would like to triangulate the evidence. The triangulation of evidence could be with the fact that what is the learner's evidence which has been submitted, what assessment has been carried out by the assessor, and then what are the key legal requirements or regulatory requirements in terms to ensure that the assessment is fit for purpose and it is meeting the guideline. So in order to triangulate the evidence, sometimes you have a lot of documentation which the IQAs have to deal with. So, for example, you would need to be familiar with an assignment brief. You would need to be familiar with, the assessment criteria. You would need to be familiar with the regulatory requirements of the qualification in terms of the key descriptors and what are the, key areas in which the assessments have to conform with the awarding body or, say a regulator's requirement. And last but not the least, you need to look at ensuring that the process which has been or the route through which this particular assessment has happened is actually fit for purpose. It is meeting the requirements and giving enough opportunities to learners to be able to then provide that evidence. And sometimes what happens is when you look at an assessment, if it is an assessment that needs to be done, say for example in IT related subjects, sometimes one of the tasks in computing units tends to be, or engineering unit tends to be, that you need to create an output or show a program code working. Now, if the assessment requires this to be done, then it cannot be submitted as an assignment. It has to be submitted as a simulated practical piece of work. Now, what the IQA needs to look at is how can technology come in to help contribute in this area, wherein it allows it to choose an appropriate method for that assessment, which can be set. And then it gives that opportunity to the learner as well as the assessor to be able to evaluate the evidence which has been submitted for the purposes of assessment. So in such cases, when you look at, you would generally see that technology would come into the aid of the IQA and the assessor and even the learner, and it will contribute to effectively then standardize and assess that bit of, let's say the judgment or the grade which has been provided at the IQA's end. So grappling with a lot of documentation, but also at the same point in time, making sure that the assessment is fit for purpose. The output which is required is helping to meet the requirements of the, the tasks which have been set, is the place where you would generally see technology coming to a need of the IQA process. So it could allow, for example, if I put it this way, it could allow instant assessments to happen, wherein you could generally see straight away that, okay, this is the route which has been taken and it's an appropriate route in the case of IT qualifications, that a piece of code needs to be submitted and you need to show that, the code actually works. So in such cases, what happens is the assessment requires the use of a software to record the output of that program. It could be Screenomatic, it could be any of the Chrome extensions, or you could use Camtasia, any sort of software which allows you to see whether that particular assessment which has been set for the assignment has been done descriptively, but also then as a practical component, and it shows it's working. It could also be used for enhanced reporting and monitoring. If you look at a larger setup, sometimes the IQA process, which is happening across universities and large FE colleges, you would generally see that there are a number of people which are involved. There are a number of assessments, number of subject areas, number of units, and in such cases, technology can come to an aid. So obviously, softwares like ProMonitor, kind of help in the process of managing this, for the IQA, for the lead IQA. Data management, again, it can be done through this particular process of using the software called ProMonitor, use of automation in AI, which is now increasingly coming in to automate assessments. And also, when we look at universities, the development of Rubik's Cube structures for assignments allow Turnitin and Turnitin Studio and some of the other softwares to essentially look at, automating some part of this, because what it allows the software to do is detect the key descriptors, or key command verbs in the tasks, and then relate it to some sort of assessments which have been carried out, and that then allows the IQA to essentially look at conferring or agreeing or disagreeing with that particular decision. One of the things that we see now, IQA processes are also carried out remotely. They are no longer carried out in person all the time. So virtual meetings and collaborations, which can typically happen primarily through the route of, using software. So if you imagine a university which has centers in 5 or 6 locations, when the exam board happens twice a year in June and say December or whenever the timeframes are fixed, what you'll generally see is that some part of this is done through collaborative meetings, which could be done through Teams, Zoom, Skype, whatever as a medium, and it allows all the IQAs and all the various centers to get online to carry out standardization meetings or discuss the results of the exam board. So they tend to be the advantages of how technology is now contributing and aiding the whole process of IQA and IQA assessment and helping IQAs primarily to manage this process more effectively. Now, in terms of some of the key learning outcomes that we look at when you look at discussing what are the regulatory and requirements from a point of view of carrying out an IQA, as I mentioned very briefly earlier, that we need to be looking at some of the aspects of what you need to be aware of in your job role. So it's like saying, if I am in the IQA role, what are my key responsibilities, and am I aware of my job responsibilities or not? So one of the things that you have to look at is confidentiality, which is something which is a legal requirement, so that you understand certain policies and procedures and regulatory requirements like Data Protection, Computer Misuse Act. You are aware of, say, for example, Equality and Diversity Discrimination Act. These are legal requirements that you need to know, and in your role, you would put them into practice at some stage when you are discussing or checking assessments or making sure you are discussing or giving feedback to assessors. Now, in such cases, you would need to ensure that confidentiality is kept in mind, and in such cases, this would meet the regulatory requirements. Then you look at, if you're working within a particular setup and it's a physical premises that you're working in, then sometimes you also need to conform to health and safety requirements. And these health and safety requirements generally tend to be across the organization. In our case, every Fridays we have a fire drill, and if the bell goes off for more than 5 seconds, then it is understood that there's a drill happening or there's a situation wherein there's a procedure that you need to follow. So when you're carrying out your duties effectively, and if there is, if you are in a physical premises and you are chairing that meeting, or you're obviously involved in working on the process, then you are also required to ensure that health and safety of your own health and safety and health and safety of your colleagues is put is paramount. And in such cases, you are aware of the evacuation procedure, or if in some cases when fire drill happens, what is to be done. So you're aware of some of these policies and procedures which are regulatory requirements. Equality and diversity and non-discrimination policy, which is under the Equalities Act of 2010. Obviously, in some cases here, what you're looking at is ensuring that the aspects of when I look at the demographics aspects of a learner or an assessor, they are not taken into context or taken into any sort of context for the purposes of carrying or giving out judgments. And in such cases, what you're ensuring is that you are making sure that you are able to work across with a number of colleagues or work across with a number of learners and assessors without bringing the demographics or taking into account some of these background related requirements like disability, gender, culture, where you come from and things like that, race, religion. So again, you're making sure that if you have people who have special requirements or any sort of disability, then you are aware of them, and because you're aware of them, that allows you to essentially then put reasonable adjustments into place so that the people who are working with you in that team do not feel disadvantaged as far as their working or their requirements are concerned. Now, in terms of other standards, what you will also be looking at is, when you look at, apart from legal requirements, what are the policies and procedural requirements? You're obviously aware of some of the organizational policies. So when you look at academic malpractice policy, you look at training policy or training and development policy of the organization. You're looking at the plagiarism policy, the teaching and learning strategy. In our case, it also will include the internal verification policy. So these are bits that you are aware of, and you are able to relate it to the requirements of the organization when you put and you start working essentially as an IQA. So legal side, which are following awarding body guidelines, off-call guidelines, any sort of acts which are there. And when you look at policies and procedures, they will be more related to mirroring the internal policies and procedures of the organization, but they will have a reflection of or inclusion of certain relevant points from the awarding organizations or regulators in your own policy, which reflect and mimic that these are requirements, these policies and procedures are actually meeting. And when they are to be implemented, you understand the process of implementation as well. You understand how to carry out and use a policy to be able to carry out a process. And in such cases, when it is required to be done, you do not hesitate. And because of your understanding of the policy, you're able to then practically implement it to ensure that the required outcomes or the required, for example, objectives are essentially met. So I've summarized that in a bit of a table here. And sometimes what you would see is that IQAs would also have professional body memberships. So when we look at maintaining our CPD, what we are also looking at is at some stage maybe joining or having a membership of a professional organization, which goes to show that you are, understanding of the industry standards or the processes which are required to effectively work, and deliver services when you work as an IQA or an internal quality assurer. So those are bits that you are going to be looking at, essentially when we talk about, legal and regulatory requirements as far as the learning outcome, overarching aspect of learning outcome is concerned. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
No.
With this bit of understanding, let's go into some of the assessment criteria and understand what would be the, detailing of it. So the first assessment criteria is also talking about we need to look at evaluating legal policies, issues, procedures relevant to the IQA process that you carry out internally within the organization. So here, what I would suggest is that you would need to look at picking out a few policies, which will be, something that you will cross-reference in this particular task. And these policies would essentially help you do the evaluation. So in our case, my suggestion would be to look at going on to the UK Versity site, and under policies on the footer, which is the fourth footer at the bottom of the home page, there is a link to policies. And when you go into the links for policies, what you are going to be able to see is that there are a number of policies which have been, included. And from there, what I would suggest is that you are picking out policies which are related to data protection that you need to have an understanding on. You need to look at picking up equality and diversity policy, health and safety policy, and then last but not the least, you're also looking at picking out, standardization policies, which are predominantly, carried out when we look at the process of IQA, or I will put it this way, internal verification policy, or IV policy as it was called earlier, but now it is called the IQA policy. So these few policies, if you pick up, read, and then, look at explaining that why is it related to the field of internal quality assurance and assessment, would actually cover this particular task. So the task is asking us to essentially look at evaluation, which means you need to bring the evidence together, which is to cross-reference some of these policies. You would not need to include these policies in the assessment criteria or the assignment when you do it later. But the idea here would be to have and show that you have relevant knowledge of some of the key policies and legal issues which are highlighted in these policies. And you could pick out 4 in general, which is data protection, equality and diversity. We are looking at health and safety. And then last but not least, the IQA policy or internal verification policy. And that would help explain, what is the legal and practice requirements, including confidentiality, health and safety, welfare. And then that would help you understand and cover this particular assessment criteria. Is that okay? There's not much to explain in this, but what you have to do is show a bit of understanding, a deeper understanding that how legal frameworks, policies, and legal frameworks are put together by regulators and awarding bodies, how policies and procedures aid in and help you and aid in carrying out the quality assurance processes in your organization. And these collectively, when I say collectively, I mean legal regulations and policies and procedures collectively support educational institutions or any sort of educational setup to maintain the standards which are required to conduct assessments. And keeping in mind the policies of confidentiality, data protection, what you're looking at is ensuring a high level of integrity while maintaining and while I would say ensuring and maintaining that these regulatory requirements are met and are kept in mind. But at the same time, what it allows you to do is by following these policies, it allows you to promote a safer learning environment or an inclusive learning environment for your learners and your assessors. So in this case, the idea is to basically explain this process of how legal frameworks and policies and procedures are going to aid in carrying out the quality assurance processes within your organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
No, sir, nothing from my side.
Right. So what I've done is towards the end, what I've done is basically prepared a bit of a table, and that table essentially allows you to understand the various ways in which policies and procedures, which are used within the organization can help in you carrying out, or let's say being effective as an IQA. So things like when you know who I need to talk to and how these issues, or if there are any example here, if I put it this way, if there's an issue or if there's a complaint, say for example, which comes up that the learner is not happy with the grade which has been provided by the assessor on the unit. Now, this would mean that there are two things which will happen. One, it triggers a complaint. Second, it triggers a process which the IQA would need to follow, because at some stage you would have conformed with or agreed with the grade which the assessor has provided. So in such cases, when discussions happen with the learner and internally some sort of discussions happen with the assessor, you have to keep in mind that you need to discuss things which are in perspective and in relation to individual learners or the assessor. And in such cases, you would look at maintaining data integrity or data confidentiality. Now, when we look at equality and diversity, you are going to look at the merits of the complaint. You look at it independently without taking into account any background or any such parameters which could help you or which would basically influence your decision. And in such cases, if it is not resolvable at your end, then you have to compile a report which goes to the higher authorities like the principal or the director of education. And in such cases, your report has to be neutral in the sense it has to not include elements of, cultural background, say, for example, race, religion, and things like that. So you are ensuring that whatever report is put forward is factual and accurate and does not, and basically follows the guidelines of equality and diversity policy. Health and safety might not come in that aspect, but when you look at confidentiality, sometimes these complaints, when they are made, or decisions regarding disagreement regarding decisions on gradings are done, sometimes learners are wary of the fact that they say, okay, this should not affect my working with the assessor or my teachers. And in some cases what tends to happen is that when this is raised, you have to maintain confidentiality in order to protect the identity of the learner. And in most cases, when this decision is put forward, the learner's name and some of the other details are anonymized so that the decision can be done on the basis of facts which are presented. Now, when we look at standardization procedures, it could be something that you can relate to, because if they come up, then there could be amendments or changes which need to be required, which could be required to be done. because if there are successive such complaints or issues which are being encountered, then that means the method of assessment needs to be looked at. Is it fit for purpose? And is the assessor requiring further training, or if the assessment is happening as per the required standards or not? And that is what you would pick up in the standardization process or policy at some stage. And then learners, assessors, and even IQAs have the right to look at feedback and obviously appeal a particular decision if they feel that this is not correct, and that would be done through the complaints or procedures policy, or complaints or compliments policy in our case, and that also would be something which the IQA needs to be aware of, and that could be used for the purposes of evaluation of the quality assurance process and the assessments which are carried out. So it could be a case in point of actually reflecting on some of the policies and other bits to ensure that you are able to, I would say, bring it together and then explain how they are implemented, in the context of IQA. So the second assessment criteria that we want to go to is talking about different ways in which technology helps to contribute towards the internal quality assurance process or assessments. Now, we discussed some brief aspects of it earlier, but just to recap here. So what I've, one second. So what we have to look at in this case is what we discussed earlier is that when we talk about technology and how technology comes to our aid as an IQA, what we are looking at essentially is, talking about the usages of technology, which is primarily, helping us to carry out this process much more effectively, and, getting more and more people involved who should be involved in this particular process. So when we talk about, the aspect of technology, if I think of certain things in terms of how we carry out the IQA process at our end, we look at things like usage of Zoom, or, meetings that we do virtually. These meetings typically tend to happen online. And when we look at doing these meetings take the, I would say, the basic approach of helping us reach out to colleagues who are working with us remotely. And also, to a certain extent, what we then also do is that we are also looking at using technology to look at data management, some part of it in terms of electronically carrying out, the process of, I would say, assessments. And if I also put it this way, that in some cases, we would also look at storing of IQA material, because records, when you look at within the organization, they have to be stored for a period of 3/4 years, depending on the awarding body, recording, depending on the requirements of the awarding body. And in such cases, storage and archival of records, which are assessment records, IQA records, can also be done using the use of technology. So when we look at in general, how does this happen in certain organizations, they use an electronic version of the IQA system, which allows the learner to submit an assignment online. There is, if I look at Moodle that we use, there is an advanced version of Moodle called Mahara, which we are also trying to implement from 1st of July. That particular system would allow learners to submit assignments online on Moodle. Now, once the assignment is submitted, you'd also see that an email gets triggered to the assessor who's teaching that relevant unit to mark the assignment. The marking of the assignment will happen on the platform, and that platform would allow annotation of notes or commenting to be done. And then once that is submitted by the assessor, it'll trigger 2 emails. One email will go to the learner to say your assessment has been done. This is what the grade has been awarded. And you want to look at the feedback or the assessment. If it has been referred, graded, whatever, will actually go back to the learner. And a copy of that email will also be triggered towards the IQA. The IQA would then be able to see and triangulate the evidence which is coming in from the learner, how the assessment has been done, what is the time frame in which the assessment has happened, Is the feedback which has been sent back, timely and appropriate? And is the feedback developmental? And at some stage, if everything goes through, then IQA will also be able to pick out samples of the portfolio and do the IQA process online itself. So technology would, in this case, act not just as a repository, or would not just allow data management, but would, along with repository acting as a place where it can be stored, allows records to be accessed electronically at a click of a button, makes it easier for the learner, the assessor, and the IQA, and also the organization. And last but not the least, it speeds up this process of how assessments and IQA can be carried out. And then when you have to look at updates, reporting, dashboards, the technology would then allow this to also be visible, because you could generally see as a snapshot. If you ask a report to be generated, the report would essentially say, okay, 10 people in this say cohort studying the course, 6 have submitted assignments, 4 haven't. The 4 of the 6 assignment have been marked, and the IQ is able to pick up the plan. And if you extend that process outward, what you're going to be seeing is that the external examiner will also be able to see this paper trail, electronic paper trail, to be able to carry out the process of external examination more effectively. So technology can help in various ways, and these various ways, I've created a few slides to cover that up. But generally, going by my experience and how we would plan the IQA process and use technology in terms of ensuring that the processes work and it makes it quicker, more efficient, and more productive, we can look at various ways in which technology can be included. So just to look at some summary, we have technology being able to help us file records digitally, retrieve data digitally. It allows us to look at managing the process of assessment online. Some part of the assessment can also be automated using the use of AI right now. Turnitin Studio, to a certain extent, and Progress Essays, there are lots of softwares which are coming up which are allowing this process to be automated. And to a certain extent, it is able to generate feedback and obviously give details, to the students in terms of developmental feedback, so that they can improve the work. And and thereby also not just improving the work, but also shaving off a bit of time which is spent between carrying out some of these activities. Now, there are various forms of technology which are available, which can be utilized. There are team collaboration tools, which are from different platforms. We have tried to implement Slack within the organization, which is a team collaboration tool amongst the assessors and IQA, but obviously it's at a very nascent stage in terms of working through. We use a CRM system. There is use of obviously Microsoft platforms, including SharePoint, and where data can be stored, it can be easily retrieved depending on user permissions and profiles. And that all allows collaboration to happen between learners, assessors, and IQA, and creates a central repository or a data management system within any organization. So in today's context, technology cannot be excluded. And I think from a point of view of when we look at teaching and learning, technology is being used quite in detail in a lot of organizations. And one such example, which I have given, the use of Moodle and Mahara and Pro Monitor, which is done on a Windows platform, and Microsoft, suite of softwares, including Team, SharePoint, and collaboration that it allows, the teams to work on, whether it's assessors and IQAs, allows the whole process of the whole process of assessments and IQA speeded up and obviously available at one place. So there could be various ways in which you could, explain this particular task. And I've done a table here again, just for the purposes of finding out, how does technology help? It helps us in recording findings, providing online feedback, and also from a point of view of planning. So one of the things that we do as IQAs is obviously in some places the IQA plan is ongoing, but in some places like universities and colleges wherein there are fixed intakes across the year, February and September, or January and August, you generally see that a lot of planning side of the things are also done using technology. So you create what are called interim sampling plans and final, or at the end of the session planning sampling plans, and they are also done and can be done using the use of technology, and obviously then available online for the purposes of availability and monitoring, for different people within the setup. It could be management, it could be the deputy head, it could be the program manager or the curriculum manager, and they are able to see versions of it because the data actually lives on the cloud, and that allows this to be automated as a process. And then what I've done is to explain the table, I've basically, detailed out one odd slide each to, give you some idea in terms of how this would be implemented in a particular setup. So use of the assessment management systems, student management systems, CRM, Pro Monitor, Moodle are systems which are now being used increasingly as technological aids to essentially further enhance the, IQA process. Any questions on this so far?
No, sir, nothing from
In
my side.
August, it won't be.
Yes, go ahead. Okay.
No, sir, nothing from my side.
Okay. Now, the next assessment criteria is, we are looking at explaining the value of reflective practice and continuous professional development, or CPD, in relation to, IQA process. So one of the key things that we are aware of, that when we do talk about the process of development and training, we see that in most teaching setups and organizations, we have somebody maintaining the CPD side of things, which is to ensure that regular trainings are happening, regular updates are provided. Now, why is this required? So if we look at, without going into the details of the learning assessment criteria, let's look at a couple of things. So how do we keep track of IQA as updates which are released by awarding bodies? So if there's an update to a qualification, change of specification, or an assessment criteria, or an update which comes once in 5 years, when we look at qualifications being updated and changed to suit the requirements of employers, learners, and also the key standards within the industry. So in such cases, what tends to happen is that, one, you need to be aware of what are these changes which are happening. Second is, you need to be able to track some of these changes and how they're related to the field or the area of your responsibility that you operate in. And last but not the least, how do you look at adopting best practices, which could be things that you bring into your organization or in your work on a day-to-day basis, which will allow you to be more effective, or it will allow you to be, say, a better, carry out some of the responsibilities that you do in a much more efficient and a better manner. Now, when we look at all this as a, as a process, one of the things that we look at is reflection. And reflection is nothing but the ability for us individually to be able to reflect on one's action and how we can engage or change the process or the way I carried out that particular action. So with a bit of hindsight, if I carry out something right now and I did do it in a particular way, but now that I know the outcome of this process, or the process that I took to come to that outcome might not have been the right process, then what we tend to do is, once you've carried that out for the first time, if it is for the first time, then what you do is you have some learnings from it. And this process of reflection that we are able to do, because we are able to ensure that if we are to do that exercise or that task again, then we are able to adapt to meeting the needs of our learners or assessors, then that would be something that we will do through the process of what is called reflection. So here is where the Gibbs reflective cycle comes in, wherein when we look at IQA, we have a good understanding of how this cycle works. We look at teaching, self-assessment, we make considerations, and then we put that into practice after making some changes. And this, when we reflect, in terms of how we are going to take the actions again in order to ensure that the outcomes achieved the next time are meeting the requirements, would be essentially done through the process of what is called reflective practice. Now, reflective practice can also inform of what areas we need to be able to look at development, and that would then be picked up by our manager or somebody who's supervising and is is in control of that particular function or department, and they would encourage you to get into trainings. These trainings would help you develop skills or maybe cover some of your gap areas, and they would effectively make you, or they would essentially help, these trainings and activities that you undertake would effectively help you to become a better IQA in, or do your role much more effectively. So this process of identifying strengths, your weaknesses, and what are the areas for improvement which could be looked at on an annual basis would essentially be the process of what is called continuous development or continuous professional development. And by engaging in reflective practice, what we as educators, teachers, tutors, lecturers, or instructors, whichever way you call it, educators would do, would be using some of these methods and strategies that would help us in better meeting the requirements of our learners. And in your case, as an IQA, assessors, because you're not directly involved with working with the learners, but you're directly involved with assessors. And what you're looking at is through the assessors and through the route which assessors take in terms of showing or checking or marking the work, you are in touch with your indirectly in touch with the learners, and then you're confirming whether the achievements are there or not. And that is why this process of reflection is very important as far as IQ is concerned. So some of the key things that we want to look at in terms of key topics when we look at reflective practice is to understand what is reflective practice, how do we develop current, or bring in, say, a best practice into the organization or in the process of doing IQA if it is not already there in the organization. And then how do we use the feedback process which comes in? Because in some cases, I don't know whether you've seen, and I'll show you one or two templates, is that when we see certain documents, what we also see in those documents is that there is a way that learners can give feedback to the assessors. And then the assessor gets feedback from the IQA. And there is a space in the IQA sheet which has a place wherein the assessor can also give feedback to the IQA. And this part of the process completes, a 360-degree or a circle, which essentially ensures that, even IQAs are able to receive feedback, when it comes to ensuring, improvements or changes which are required to be done as far as, I would say, the process of, improvements are concerned. So let me show you two documents just very briefly. These two documents essentially are documents which you would see that there are places where when we talk about 360-degree appraisal or feedback mechanisms, there is a place where you would generally see that the EQA can give feedback to IQA, the IQA can give feedback to the assessor gives the feedback to the learner, but at some stage you would also see the vice versa works. The learner can give feedback to the assessor can give feedback to the IQA, and IQA can discuss that feedback with the EQA to ensure that when visits happen, they are fit for purpose. So as you can see, this is this assessor's feedback to learner. And then there is IQA and EQA comments which can be put forward. And then if I show you another document, which typically, would be a document which talks about how the learner can actually give feedback, to say, for example, the EQA, that form is also relevant as far as the IQA process is concerned. So let's look at the second document. And this is the second document, which is an IQA report, wherein the IQA is giving feedback to the assessor. So you're giving some feedback on the assessment criteria and how the guidelines have been followed. But towards the end, there is feedback to the assessor. Now, there is a place where assessor can also give feedback to the IQA. And that space generally we leave out blank, but it could be areas that you pick up wherein you are explaining to the IQA that I need, further training, or I need, say, for example, understanding on this, and that would be done in that particular, report itself. And this can be documented. And then finally, the learner giving feedback This is one such example wherein obviously details are shared with the EQA. The learners have the ability to give feedback about the center and the process they've been through in terms of studying that qualification, and that would be, showing that this process essentially works 360-degree in terms of feedback mechanisms. Now, this is where the reflective practice comes in. This is where the learners get, and when we look at the reports which are shared, by the EQA, in terms of giving feedback to the center, is actually showing us very clearly how this process of reflective practice works. So there is a specific section in most of these reports, and these reports generally have these sections because it'll identify any action points. As you can see, there will be feedback given to the center on the action points. This will be monitored. There will be observations and feedbacks on assessment, as you would see. Then there is observation on the internal quality assurance processes, and feedback is given. And then towards the end, there would be an opportunity for the center to be also able to give feedback, to the IQA. So this is a section for learner feedback, and then the action plan which has been finalized, and then towards the end, in which you want to discuss with the EQA is also available, and then commenting from the center to the EQA is also a part of that process. So we are able to give feedback to the EQA as well to say that this is what is required to be done, or this is how we would want things to happen. And that is the process of, effectively seeing, um, you know, um, this process essentially becomes, let's say, the starting point for CPD. Because if there is action plan given by the EQA to the center, that action plan can be then has to be divided into a plan of action for assessors and IQA, because there are things which are not conforming to the quality process, and those actions would then need to be, carried out separately by individual people, in order to ensure that the quality processes are meeting the criteria. So I showed you a report, and just as an example, there were a couple of action points in that report. And as you would see, this report, that the action points which are given in that report are picked up and converted into what is called a corrective action plan by the center head, in this case by me, and the lead IQA. And what happens is the responsibilities are clearly divided in terms of which areas they are falling in. So assessment part of it generally would be looked after by the assessors, but monitored by the IQA. The IQA part of it would be monitored by the IQA himself, and also the EQA at some stage when the next visit happens. And this kind of a thing, which is, looking at essentially going through, let's say, continuously looking at the processes and policies and ensuring that the compliances related to quality assurance are in place within the center, allows that to happen and run through the process of reflection and through the process of continuous professional development. Is that okay? Any questions on this? So what I've done is,
No.
okay, I've created a bit of a table here, and that basically goes through some of the key points that we want to look at, for explaining the value of reflective practice and CPD for the purposes of, the internal quality assurance processes. Now, that brings us into the last assessment criteria, which is looking at evaluating the requirements of equality and diversity in relation to internal quality assurance process. So here, what we are looking at primarily is that we want to understand how do you implement the equality and diversity policy in relation to the IQA process. Very direct, task, which primarily is focused on asking you a question to say, how do you look at evaluating the requirements of equality and diversity in relation to you being an internal quality assurer? And when you carry out IQA process or verification for the assessments of your assessors, what are the key considerations you take into account as far as equality and diversity policy is concerned? So in this case, when I talk about the key aspects of it, we will go back to, the aspects of what is required to be considered for making sure that we are conforming with and making sure we are conforming with the equality and diversity policy of the organization. So, couple of things that you look at. One, you look at the requirements of say for example, legal and ethical frameworks, which is to say that you comply with implementing this policy in the organization. And if I talk about what is equality and diversity policy, and I show you the equality and diversity policy of UK Versity. So if I just very briefly show that to you, just give me 1 second. So if I show where do you find the policy? You go into the footer of the website, and then you go into all policies. And when you are in all policies, what you do is basically click on the equality and diversity policy. It opens up as a new document or a window. And that is what defines what the policy the institution follows. So here the idea is that we are trying to maximize the, the usage of, or I'll put it this way, that what we want to do in the organization is treat everyone fairly. We don't want to be looking at discrimination. We don't want to be looking at any aspects of caste, culture, religion, background, race, where people are coming from. And what we want to do is give an equal platform to everyone to be able to work and, obviously look at the work that they present on its merits and then assess it and then award a grade. So this reflects taking into account the legal requirements of the Equality and Diversity Act or the Equality Act of 2010. Now, this particular act ensures that as an educational institution, you need to conform to a couple of key points which are mentioned in the legislation or the act. One is you would not discriminate against anybody. You would, as a IQA, be responsible for in ensuring that you're able to detect if there is any harassment, victimization happening with the learner or the assessor. Is there some sort of collusion happening or not? If there is some sort of harassment or bullying or discrimination happening, so as a result, what you are expected to do is be vigilant and able to pick out signs of, if there are signs which are coming to your notice of learners being harassed or assessors being harassed, or if anybody is playing the victim card. You are then also looking at understanding what are the key aspects of promoting opportunity for all learners and assessors within the organization. And then you are ensuring that you foster good relations between the team and the people that you work with directly to carry out this process. Now, when you do that, you're not going to take into account these characteristics, things like age, disability, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, and whether you're married or unmarried. These things would not come into account. So your understanding of the policy would allow you to work as an effective IQA. And that effectiveness of working as an internal verifier within the organization would need you to have a good understanding of the Equalities Act of 2010 and the policy which the organization has created following that particular act. And that is what you need to do and show when you look at implementing it, adhering it to it, and monitoring it to ensure that all the standards required are being met. Things like health and safety, we talked about confidentiality, we talked about implementation of some of the organizational procedures, which are looking at things like assessment policy, malpractice policy. Those are bits that you are complying with to ensure that they are being taken into account and adhered to when we look at the requirements for equality and diversity policy and its implementation from an IQA perspective. So you are required to be aware of the policy. You are required to be able to understand the aspects of the policy and how it needs to be implemented. In some cases, you would also be looking at understanding if there are any, let's say, the correct word would be if there are any, let's say, variations of that leading to victimization, harassment, bullying, then you are able to take into account that aspect and then inform the IQA processes and relevant authorities in the organization so that relevant action could be taken against the assessor or the learner, or if it is something which is systematic, then against a particular process that needs to be put into place. And last but not the least, as a custodian of the whole process of assessments, an insurer and you are ensuring that the quality of such assessments is done in a manner which is fair, consistent, reliable, and fit for purpose. You are also monitoring that process using some of these policies and procedures which are implemented in the organization. Now, to give a practical example of how this would be done, is that when you look at assignments being released and assignments being submitted, one such case which tends to happen is that the IQA needs to sign off the assignment brief. The assignment brief is signed off by the IQA. There is a set date of release. There's a set date of submission of that assignment. Now, anybody who's able to submit before that date meets that criteria. Anybody who's not able to submit by that date, which is the learner I'm talking about, then in these cases, there is a policy and a procedure defined, and that would be followed through as it is defined for everyone which falls behind that date for submission. Now, that is where you're looking at equality and diversity policy, that you're not slipping anything in. You're not allowing this learner to be, meeting that criteria, and some learners not meeting the criteria. But what you'll do is follow a simple benchmark to say that this is the policy, this is the procedure, this is the norm. That is what everybody would need to conform to. And in such cases, the same assignment briefs is released to all the learners. The same assessor guidelines are to be followed when assessors are marking the assignment for the learners, and the submission dates tend to be fixed. If say, for example, if the student fails the assignment or does not meet the criteria of the assignment in the first instant, there is a second assignment which is normally given as an opportunity for the learner to pass the assessment. And in such cases, the policy defines that the marks are capped at pass, because you're attempting a resubmit or a unit that you've studied, you've submitted the assignment, you've failed, but you're looking at resubmitting to give you a second opportunity to pass that unit. And that would be defined, and related to the assessment policy. You are then implementing that policy from a point of view of keeping in mind equality and diversity policy, and that would be related to this particular assessment criteria. Any questions on this so far?
Nothing, sir.
So that's what has been explained in subsequent slides, so that you are able to take an example and use it for the purposes of how the equality and diversity policy would be taken into account. As an IQA, you're making sure you're not discriminating, you're not giving somebody. Sometimes we get to hear, okay, he's my favorite student, I'll give you a distinction mark. So that bit is done away with when we implement this policy, and ensure that as an IQA, I'm safeguarding, I'm ensuring there is no victimization, there's no bullying, there's no harassment which is happening at the learner's end and also at the assessor's end, and ensuring that relevant policies, codes of practice are followed to ensure that the processes are robust and fit for purpose. So these would be the requirements of understanding the assessment criteria 4.4, which talk about evaluating requirements of equality and diversity in relation to internal quality assurance process and assessment. So this brings us to the end of this particular first unit. And what we're going to do is do an assignment discussion on this unit next week to try and then come to a completion on the first unit, which is understanding the principles and assessments or practices of internal quality assurance. If you think of any questions, I'm going to try and upload, the revised version of this presentation on Moodle just after this session. I'll also put one or two, reading, I would say points towards the end, which policies and procedures you need to refer to. And my suggestion would be to try and go through them for the purposes of understanding today's assessment criteria. And apart from that, if you think of any questions or if you need anything, then please drop me an email and we'll take it from there. So If there are no more questions, I am going to end today's session, and I will see you next week so that we can discuss the assignment.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Bye for now.